sampled instruments are widely used as sound sources. In many cases, they come as part of big libraries designed for some specific software like Kontakt, but in some cases they may come as a bunch of WAV files, and then you have to make a sampled instrument yourself via tools in your DAW. I'm Alex, and today I want to talk about making such an instrument in Ableton Live. However, even if you're using a different DAW, you may still find some useful information in this video and apply it there. So please don't rush away right now, but rather stay a while and listen. So what is a sampled instrument anyway? A sampled instrument is an instrument that was sampled note by note using a microphone. And the more notes were sampled, the more accurate the final result is, the more HDD space is required to store it. That's why in most cases a sampled instrument would include 4 notes per octave: C, D sharp, F sharp and A. And the reason is that this method skips only 2 out of every 3 notes, which is a nice balance between accuracy and required space. So the reason I decided to make this video is, despite the whole process of making a sampled instrument from a bunch of WAV files seems straightforward, it is actually not. And if you ever did it yourself, remember how many times you were disappointed by the final result because the sound wasn't good enough. You can compare this process with changing guitar strings, for example. So each string is your sample, and applying them to the guitar is just putting these samples into some specific tool in your DAW. But to make a guitar sound right, you need to tune the strings. The same thing is with sampled instruments. And I can tell you that after spending months on trying and failing, finding answers, facing new questions and polishing the process, well, there is something practical that I can finally share with you. In a minute, I'll give you a step-by-step guide on turning your sampled instruments WAV files into a perfectly usable sound source. To do that, you need to follow 4 subsequent steps done in one of Ableton's tools. Depending on which version of Ableton Live you're using, you may have access to either Sampler or Simpler. In Ableton Live, Intro and Standard, you only have Simpler. In Suite, you have both. But don't worry, I'll show you how to do everything in each of them. If that sounds promising, let's dive in. Before we start the actual work on a sampled instrument, let's do some preparation. So first, think of a sampled instrument you might be working on along with me. If you don't have such an instrument and you don't know where you can get one for free, take it from Native Instruments Complete Start package. It has expansion selection, which includes some of these, and these samples can be accessed directly from your DAW. As for me, in this video I'll be working on Soraya Lead from expansion selection. And by the way, of course, we are not sponsored by anyone. Telling this just in case our channel explodes after this video, but right now sponsoring us makes absolutely no sense. And second, I suggest we prepare some templates for Simpler and Sampler so that you don't have to do all this stuff again when you decide to work on another sampled instrument. And basically I'll point to some settings that I changed from defaults. This is because I strongly believe that we should leave all the samples intact and change the sound at later production stages. Add an instance of Simpler to a MIDI track and change the following settings. On main page, deactivate loop, snap and retrigger, and set voices to 32. In lower section, turn off filter and LFO, change decay to minimum and set release to 250 milliseconds. On controls page, deactivate pitch envelope and change it to amplitude. Convert Simpler to an instrument track by pressing Ctrl G or Command G and open the chain list. Now you can save the instrument track with Simpler as a template. Add an instance of Sampler to a MIDI track. Go to Filter Global page, turn off Filter Envelope and Filter. Deactivate Retrigger and set voices to 32. Set decay to minimum and release to 250 milliseconds. I also recommend converting sampler into instrument rack by pressing Ctrl G or Command G so that you can make additional adjustments later. You can save this instrument rack with sampler as a template now. When activated, Retrigger will relaunch the sample from beginning every time you hit the key. And in deactivated state, a new sample will be placed on top of already played sample if you hit the same key again. So it will take more resources in deactivated state to play many samples at once. But in activated state, retriggering of samples will be hearable for instruments with slow attacks such as pads or strings. In most cases it is not necessary, but if you ever need it for artistic purposes, you know how to turn it back. Number of voices defines how many samples can be played simultaneously. More voices will require more computer power, but less voices will prevent you from playing complex chords or keeping Retrigger in deactivated state. So if you get artifacts on 32 voices, try lowering it down to find out how many your computer is capable to cope with. Note that this is the right time to add any other controls you may be using in the future. As for me, I recommend adding control to velocity to volume, for example. And I won't explain it here because I have a fully detailed video with all the firings on the channel. So if you didn't watch it, do it before you start working on your sampled instruments so that you can finish all the preparations beforehand. Now we are ready to put all our samples into our saved templates. Count how many samples of a sampled instrument you have and create that many instances of Simpler. You can do that by selecting Simpler within Instrument Rack and pressing Ctrl D or Command D. This way you will keep all the settings we made in every new instance of Simpler. In this example, I have 5 samples, so I'll create 5 instances of Simpler. Go through them one by one and insert one sample at a time into each Simpler. Try to insert samples as close to the central area of Simpler as possible, otherwise Simpler will reset the defaults. Open the Rack's key view and make sure that all the samples cover the whole key range. If not, adjust it by dragging edges of these lines. Press Hide when done. Now you can save the instrument rack with the name of a sampled instrument. Process in Sampler is much faster and easier. Open Zone section and drag and drop all your samples here. Make sure that all the samples cover the whole key range, and if not, adjust it the same way as with Simpler. Close Zone when done. Save the instrument rack with the name of a sampled instrument. At this point, Ableton doesn't know yet which notes are sampled in which samples we just added. And we cannot trust the info about root notes that may be mentioned in samples files names, because it can be very far from reality. That's why we need to check the root notes of each sample manually. So think of a guitar again. This instrument is designed in such a way that you can play the same note on different strings. Well, in most cases. We'll be doing exactly the same thing. We'll adjust parameters of each sample until it plays a note which frequency we already know. I'll be using C3, which has a frequency of 262 Hz. And it's important that at this step we are not aiming at perfect tuning. We only need to make sure that our samples play somewhere around C3. So before we start, let's create a MIDI clip 2 bars in length. Put it in the loop by pressing Ctrl L or Command L. Add a MIDI note to it. I'll add C3. And add 2 instances of tuner to our MIDI track after the instrument track. Make 1 instance of tuner display Hertz. Remember that tuner may not always be accurate because samples can be complex and tricky. That's why it is crucial to trust your ears. As a support, you can create one more MIDI track or audio track and insert a testing tone sample you can trust. Do an A/B testing while making adjustments to be sure that the frequencies match. In this example, I'm gonna be using operator as the testing tone for properly tuning the samples. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna duplicate this clip and move it to the secondary MIDI track and then add an instance of operator to the MIDI track. And now when I press play, I'm gonna hear the pure C3 note. Simpler doesn't have a parameter to change root note directly and assumes that all the notes are C3 notes. So we'll have to use a workaround. So let's get back to the instrument track. Press the triangle near the sample name to open all the simplers controls. To change the root notes in simpler, we'll be adjusting the transpose parameter measured in semitones. You can only change it from -48 semitones to +48 semitones, which is 4 octaves in both directions from C3. Now I'm showing a table with all the numbers and corresponding notes, so that you can easily define the number for the root note you need, or find the root note by the number set in transpose parameter. I don't want to go into deep explanation of this right now because of timing, but for example, if you know that your sample is C4, you need to subtract 12 semitones from C3 to make it sound right. Or if your sample is F#1, you need to add 18 semitones. Alternatively, if you see that there are 27 semitones added by someone, the sample is A0, and if there are 3 semitones subtracted, then it's D#3. We need to go through all the notes one by one, put them in solo and try to find the correct settings for transpose until we get the target note, which is C3. So if you follow along using Saraya samples, C2 is +12 semitones, C3 is 0, C4 is -12 semitones, F#2 is +6 semitones, and F#3 is -6 semitones. After you found root nodes, I recommend you manually sort the instances of simpler according to these nodes, highest on top and lowest on bottom, and then save the sampled instrument. Sampler is once again a lot easier to do because each sample has root key as a parameter. Adjust it until you get C3 on tuner. When done, please sort the samples by key with higher notes being on top and lower notes being on bottom, and save the instrument. Now we are coming to the best part of the show that will define whether your final work will shine or not. What I'm going to show you is something I've been working around for too long until I found it, and I'm really excited to know whether it's going to be the same eye-opener for you as it was for me. And the whole point is that finding the root node is not enough. It's just the beginning for further adjustments. What I'm going to be talking about now is tuning, a very precise adjustment for each sample so that it hits its root node as accurate as possible. Again, think guitar. To make it sound right, you need to adjust 6 strings, sometimes 12. Here you may have any number of samples from 1 to 128. Add that each of the samples can be tuned by a parameter which varies from -50 to +50, and you get an extremely complex task with close to infinite number of combinations. And we are about to crack it. Theory says that the sounds that we hear consist of the bass frequency and the overtones, and we hear the sound as a whole. And tools like Tuner may calculate the overall combined frequency of a sound in such a way that it no longer represents the bass frequency, especially when the sound itself is very complex. That's why my idea was that to make the proper tuning, we maybe need to isolate those overtones and work with the bass frequency directly. And you know what? It worked. I suggest we do one more improvement to our project. You'll be able to save it and use it again for checking other sampled instruments, so it's totally worth it. Here's what you do. Add EQ3 between instrument rack and tuner. Select EQ3 in both tuners and convert them into audio effect rack by pressing Ctrl-G or Command-G. Open Macro Controls page, press Map, and map L and H frequencies to macro 1. Next, put the following values. The FREQ low maximum value is 262 Hz. The FREQ high minimum is 262 Hz. Right-click on the FREQ low and invert range. Press Map again to exit mapping. Set control to 0 and deactivate L and H groups and save this audio effect rack for your future work. If your target note is not C3, you need to enter its frequency instead of 262 Hz. What we did right now is we created a frequency filter with a specially designed control for adjusting its borders. When it is set to minimum, it becomes very narrow, but as we increase its value, it becomes wider. Now our job is to tune base frequency of our samples. I'll duplicate the MIDI track once again and do everything here. The process is rather simple. We need to adjust our frequency filter in such a way so that we hear the bare minimum of our sound with as little overtones as possible. Start from 0 and increase its value to get to the sweet spot, and note how much tuning you need to apply to make bass frequency stay in central part of our tuner. Remember, this step is very important, so spend some time here. For Soraya, my final tuning is -6 cents for C4, -2 cents for F#3, -2 cents for C3, -2 cents for F#2, and -7 cents for C2. This is the last and the easiest part of making a sampled instrument. The whole point is to define key ranges for each sample so that Ableton knows which sample to play when this or that MIDI note is triggered. In Simpler, we need to open keys view in an instrument rack. In Sampler, we need to open zones. Then you can decrease each sample's range to just one note and place them in position of root keys. Be careful when moving them in Sampler using mouse, because this will also move root keys. Use arrow keys instead. All you have to do then is equally distribute key ranges between root keys. I will give just one advice. Multiplying is better than dividing, so in case you have an odd amount of semitones between root keys, like 3 or 5 or 7, upscale lower note one time more than downscale the high note. Here we have 5 semitones in between, so we'll do 3 upscales and 2 downscales. And by the way, if you're working in Sampler, you can increase the quality of transposition by changing interpolation mode. This is a global setting and you need to change it only in one place to affect the whole instrument. It is set to normal as default, but you can change it to good and best. The better quality will require more computer power, so use it wisely. When done, save and enjoy your very well deserved result. And that's it for today. If you have any sampled instrument done by you previously, try using the approach shown in this video on it and let me know in the comments if you got any improvements or not. I hope this video was worth your time. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments, let's meet in the comment section below, and I will see you in next videos. Bye bye.